So 1984, the greatest year in hip hop, greatest records, greatest artists, laid the foundation for everything that came after it. Any debate?
I think hip hop will always be a voice for the people.
Hey everybody, I'm Reggie Williams, founder and CEO of Ambrosia for Heads. With me, I have Jake Payne, our editor-in-chief, and together, this is our What's the Headline podcast. We got a special episode today. I'm very, very excited about this. It's the beginning of a new series we're starting. It's not going to be every week, but from time to time, we're going to revisit like classic years in hip hop. And we're going to make arguments for why X year was the best year in hip hop. It's going to be a great debate, not between us, but really, I think, for you all to chime in and, join the conversation. Let us know what you think is the best year, what we missed of the year we're talking about. But we're going to start with a very, very special year, 1984. I'm going to dig into that. Were you even born in 1984?
You know what, man? I was born January 7th of 1984. So it's a special year to me, too.
Wow. Okay. Yeah. All right. Well, I was actually, this is a very impactful year for me. I was like coming of age at that time, and it meant a ton. So I'm really, really excited about digging in from my perspective, having lived through it, and hearing your perspective as a person who studied it and a true student of hip hop and understanding the framework that it laid. But you actually did a phenomenal article on this back in 2014. If I remember right, it was at my behest, and I think you pushed back a little bit, but then you got into it and you actually put the govy on it instead of your monitor. Yeah. But you took, let's get into it, man. Let's talk about many things. And we got a few themes here we want to go through. So first is the rap album. 1984 was a year where the rap album really started to coalesce. Before that, you had people who put out what were more like compilations. So Grandmaster Flash and Furious 5 had their album, with the message on it, and a couple other joints. Kurtis Blow had hits albums.
Sugar Hill Gang.
Yeah, Sugar Hill Gang. But there was not a real cohesive project where it was, a bunch of records recorded, over a specific time meant to be part of one project. And 1984 changed that. First was Run-D.M.C. Their eponymous album was something that really, really changed my life. The style was completely different. You had sucker MCs and Hard Times. It's like that. Songs that were really just like hard drums and hard rhymes. And prior to that, there was a lot of synth, there was soul, there were disco samples, things like that. But it really changed the way that hip hop sounded sonically at that time. But you coming in, listening to this later on, what was your impression of that? Did you have a sense of like kind of that shift in the culture?
Yeah, I mean, I did, and it's funny. There's a couple of things that happened, and I just looked today. Shout out to Dart Adams, one of the peers who I know, like yourself, lived through a lot of this. He wrote a great piece that published at OK Player on 84 too. The day I was born was the day that Hard Times with the B-side Jam Master Jay charted. It was the first, weekly release. And if you know Dart, he gets those days right. So I never realized that ahead of prepping for this week. And I look at my life and I'm like, man, that's kind of ill. But, two things happened that opened me up to the early days of hip hop. I want to say in 1998, and you might have been in the Viacom system, but MTV, working with Run-D.M.C, Bill Adler, a lot of different people, created this week or 2 weeks of programming where they aired Crush Groove. They did a lot of things that put me on as a 13 or 14-year-old guy into what was happening at 84. And also, I want to give a special shout out to in the beginning, there was rap compilation, which I'm sure you remember Def Squad doing Rapper's Delight, but you also had, Cypress Hill was on there, Wu-Tang Clan, Snoop Dogg, a host of artists that were the artists that I grew up with that were paying the utmost respect to the classics. So I'm very lucky in that in my coming of age, the same age I was when you were living through 84, my heroes, my favorite MCs of the moment were really taking time out of their careers and catalogs to pay respect. And none more than Run-D.M.C, which, you know, in my opinion, remained very active into the early 2000s, unfortunately, with the passing of, you know, Jam Master Jay. But yeah, I mean, the beat, the sound of the production change, and you can tell me this, but I have to believe that that sound, the way they delivered their rhymes and the beats that they created around them matched a new energy that was going on in the streets. I mean, I know at the time, if I'm not mistaken, you were out in the Midwest, not in New York or anything like that. But I feel like hip hop, when it's done right, the music matches what's really going on. And I think that Run-D.M.C's eponymous album had to be that. Tell me if I'm wrong.
Well, you know, like I said, I was out in the Midwest and Indiana specifically, and so we didn't have that kind of energy because, like, it wasn't that hip hop where I grew up. But you know, everything that I read and understood about that, you know, in the real time is that Run DMC really represented what was going on in Queens. You know, from not only the music and the way that they delivered it, and just the attitude, but also the look, which we'll get into. You know. But you know, one of the things about that album is that, you know, like I said, hard drums and rhymes were kind of the driver of the sound throughout. Like, and Jay's cuts and scratches were also really dope. He had a song dedicated to him, Jam Master Jammin', was really just about him cutting. But the other thing is they fused rock music, and Rockbox really kind of like took them through the stratosphere because they started to cross over, and really appeal to a suburban audience too. So even though they had that energy that they lived and were breathing, you know, in the streets in Queens, they also delivered that to the burbs, to the Midwest, to wherever, through vehicles like Rockbox.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I mean, you know, Rick Rubin deserves a huge shout out there as far as I understand the history. You know, in the days leading up to him and Russell, you know, Simmons forming Def Jam, you know, Rick was obsessed with a certain kind of rock aesthetic that I don't know if it was in huge vogue. I mean, everyone knows about what Walk This Way with Run DMC did for Aerosmith. But even before that, you know, from what I understand from reading the Beastie Boys books and just watching a host of documentaries and reading, is, you know, Rick was into that AC/DC, that, you know, stuff that was that today seems very cool, but I have to imagine at a time of, you know, new wave and 80s pop was kind of off to the side. So to grab those, you know, guitar stabs and drums and different things like that, and kind of put it in a pot and make gumbo out of it with Run DMC had to just be incredible. And it gave them their aesthetic, because let's not forget either, you know, Rev Run came up as Kurtis Blow's DJ. So he was already around and kind of participated in that disco inspired era of rap, and at the same time came out with his own sound, you know.
Yeah, Run was known as son of Kurtis Blow. You know,
Mm-hmm.
you know, the other thing the album had, which I think gets slept on, is it had a socially conscious aspect to it too. You know, songs like Hard Times touched on what was going on. Songs like 30 Days, and then It's Like That.
Yeah.
You know, I don't think Run DMC gets enough credit for, you know, breathing that kind of, like, you know, truth from what was going on, and you know, in the streets and for Black people, that they brought to that music. So really amazing album, you know. And we talked about how they shifted the sound of hip hop. There were other groups out there too, though, who kind of held on to what had, you know, been the most popular hip hop, you know, putting the message aside before that, which was more of a kind of a disco soulful type feel. And they took it and like put it on steroids. So one of those was Houdini. We just lost Ecstasy, you know, phenomenal MC, just end of last year. But Houdini, their album Escape, was also just like an unbelievable sonic masterpiece. You know, it was Larry Klein, right? Who
Larry Smith.
Larry Smith, who was the producer on a lot of that, but you know, a lot of keyboard, a lot of synth, a lot of soul, and you know, songs like Escape, Freaks Come Out at Night, 5 Minutes of Funk, really, really tapped into that big, almost kind of disco sound. But you know, that is a very, and you not being an R&B dude, like how did that music impact you when you heard it?
I mean, I love Houdini, and it's so interesting because Escape is not their first album. They came out a couple years prior, and you would know better than I would, but it had tepid success, and then came and made a really cohesive album with Larry far more involved. And for me coming into it, it's fun again. I mean, you had artists like Tupac that multiple times in his career paid homage to friends. DJ Premier, who's one of my musical heroes, has always talked about the tremendous impact that 5 Minutes of Funk had on him. And what I think is so interesting about Houdini, true of Run-D.M.C too, is these are fully formed songs, which I know you obviously get with, Grandmaster Flash and the Furious Five, and you get with Sugar Hill Gang, but we know these choruses just as well as we know the verses. And hip hop is clearly mapping its own thing, but to your point, never veering too far from R&B in some cases, or in some other artists that we'll talk about, electro or freestyle, other different kind of movements happening in music. Houdini's excellent, and I think that Escape, like Run-D.M.C, it's interesting that here we are, well over 35 years later, and we're talking about album cuts in some cases. Not every great single got a music video, but you mentioned 30 Days. Like, I listened to it a bunch in the last week, and we know that record. I know that record, even though this was the year I was born. So that's a special quality in rap that I don't know if it exists with some of those artists before 84 or their albums. Everyone knows Rapper's Delight, but I don't know that people know Sugar Hill Gang Deep Cuts unless you lived there and that was the only album you had, and you just had by proximity and exposure to it. But in 84, and there's other cases, we're going to talk about the Fat Boys in a second, where that's just so true.
Yeah, you talk about Houdini's early work. One of the first songs I've heard from them, and maybe their first single, was calling Mr. Magic's Wand, which is a song dedicated to Mr. Magic, legendary DJ here in New York City, and was produced by Thomas Dolby. People don't know that, but they had that kind of like funk disco hybrid. The other thing is that their music, even though it was endemic to a specific era, became timeless. It was brought back again and again. Songs like Friends. People think about Nas's "If I Ruled the World," and they think Lauryn Hill and like the Kurtis Blow sample, but Friends was also a big part of the fabric of that, of that template, in terms of production. That's another album that, and they had like some boom bap stuff too, like the song Big Mouth was just drums and hard rhymes, and was funny, a lot of humor in it. But they really represented, if Run-D.M.C was like the grit, Houdini was the gloss, and the two things kind of fit together.
It's so interesting about Houdini. One of the things that I never realized, and I think when we talk about, Run-D.M.C is so great because they come and they let you know in every song they're from Hollis, Queens, even down to, some of the titles that they would come up with. I have to admit, and this might be the blind spot of being younger and not living through 84. Did you know when you heard Houdini for the first time that these cats were from Brooklyn?
Not at all. Not at all. I knew they were from New York. All hip hop at that point felt like it was from New York. There was obviously, movements, starting to pop up on the West Coast and Philly and other places. But, New York definitely kind of ran hip hop at that point. So you just assume they were from New York. But, at that time, not being from New York, you don't really think about the boroughs, but that's something that Run-D.M.C did too, so people think about NWA and putting Compton on the map. What Run-D.M.C and then later LL did was they put Queens on the map, especially Hollis. Like, you knew about Hollis, Queens, no matter where you were from, if you listened to Run-D.M.C's music, because they mentioned it in so many of their songs. And it was a place that felt like somewhere where you wanted to go, and felt like, they were making it like history and putting it on the map. So Houdini didn't rep their borough that hard, so
Yeah.
you can hear from it, you know. But with others like Run-D.M.C, like you definitely knew where they're from.
Yeah, and it's so interesting. I mean, Houdini, I don't know if they don't exist if we get Jermaine Dupri. And that's not to oversimplify things, but what I love about all of these groups, Run DMC, you take them out of the equation. Do you get 50 Cent? Do you get Onyx? Do you get, so on and so forth? Maybe even the Beastie Boys, who we'll also talk about. But every one of these groups has family tree impact, both as, label executives, as just drivers of cool and culture. Yeah, and it's funny because I do think that sometimes that history, I want to talk about the Fat Boys for a second, looks at them as a little bit of a niche group or a gimmicky group, just given their name, given their personas, given all you can eat and stuff like that. But they're incredible, and we're absolutely one of the stars of '84.
Yeah, when you go back and listen to that album, and I listen to it regularly, it's timeless and it's also much more polished in the way that Houdini is. Relying on big disco soulful type beats, but songs like Can You Feel It and Jailhouse Rap and the Fat Boys song
Yeah,
itself, just so musical, like and so instrumental and deceptively. Those dudes could rap. I
yeah,
mean, you look at Crush Groove, which came out a year later. Their story is kind of told loosely, in that they won I think they won or they got second place in a talent contest, but in any case, they were good enough to be signed by the people doing it. They were initially called the Disco Three, and they played on. It's one of the first instances of using image to market
yeah.
an artist. All these artists came out in a time when music videos were just beginning, and they all had compelling videos that I still remember to this day. But Fat Boys, yeah, music remains timeless. That album was phenomenal. I will say it wasn't as strong to me as the other two, like Run
Mm.
DMC and Houdini Escape. You could put on and let them play front to back, even the instrumentals dedicated to the DJs. Fat Boys, really, those three songs kind of stick out, and then like after that, I think it dips a little bit, but super dope album.
Yeah, and I just want to add too. I mean, the Fat Boys, what they did for beatboxing, which is still, a sub element of hip hop, and you take that out of the equation. Not to say that they pioneered it, but to put it in the mainstream like that, just amazing. Because even though I know everyone always goes to Rozelle and Bismarcky and some different people, but think about how many times top tier MCs that change culture allude to beatboxing, or they choose a beat that's inspired by it. And the Fat Boys, I feel like, put that in living rooms in a way that hadn't been done before. That's just my take.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, and you just like remind me. There's two other really dope songs, "Stick 'Em" and then
Mm.
"Human Beatbox." And so while Houdini and Run DMC had their songs dedicated to the DJ, Fat Boys had their song dedicated to Buffy, the human
Yeah.
beatbox. Rest in peace.
R.I.P.
Yeah, exactly. And so Dougie Fresh is one of the pioneers of beatboxing. Obviously, did it in Beat Street and was doing it way before that. And Dougie had just the illest style. It was very percussion based. Buffy like added that deep bass and like the real like boisterous sound to it, and just brought a whole different dimension to beatboxing. But very critical to that Fat Boy sound. So we're
I have some of the 12-inch singles that they put out, on Sutra Records that they were still known as the Disco Three. And I'm so glad that they changed their name. Obviously, it had commercial impact. People they knew the association by the time they got to film. They played that persona, but those guys do not sound like the Disco Three. And it's another case of, Nardwar and different people in our culture love to ask MCs their first name. And most of our great, MCs of the 90s and 2000s had a really corny name when they started that was inspired by, the artists that were rocking when they were 10 years old. And I think that's so true of Disco 3. Like, clearly those guys were studying Cold Crush and, the Fearless Four and all those, and they came up with this very late 70s name only to get the rebrand, which of course made sense for the time.
exactly. So you have videos, and although they weren't getting play on MTV, there was BET, and BET, they had Video Soul. There was no Rap City in '84, but they did slide in rap videos periodically. So you would often see songs like Freaks Come Out at Night and Escape. Jermaine Dupri was in, you mentioned Jermaine Dupri, and he was in, I believe the video for, I believe it was Escape. It was one of those two. It was the one where the tour bus comes and, and they're singing Friends. You see a glimpse of JD in the beginning. And then UTFO, another like, seminal like rap group, also was put down by Houdini because they were, was put on by Houdini because they were their backup dancers. And Freaks Come Out at Night, I think they had on red leather. I haven't watched the video in quite a while, so it's memory. But those dudes like Kango and
the Educated Rapper and
but it's Dr. Ice.
Word.
Were dancing, for Houdini. So they brought a lot, and those visuals were like super, super dope. And then you had like Rockbox, and then with the Fat Boys, Jailhouse Rap and Can You Feel It really showcased their personality. And I wouldn't be surprised if those videos, because they were so like, such big personalities, led to their inclusion in Crush Group because they were really, really personable in the videos.
Well, I want to ask you too, and I'm purely asking because I didn't live it, but 83, Herbie Hancock puts out, Rocket, and Grandmaster or DXT does the scratches. This benchmark moment for DJs is talked about in the film Scratch. Do you think that opened up MTV? Did you feel it in real time? And I don't know if you had MTV growing up. I don't know if you were exposed like that, but could you feel the mainstream push more in 84? Even if it wasn't just videos?
You could. I mean, like I said, Rockbox really did like, kind of pave the way. And the funny thing about Rockbox is they had the guitarist, I forget his name, but they had him come and play a few licks. And initially they thought they were just gonna, put them in and out and like, drop them, but just have them be accents. And they heard it and like it was going the whole time, and somebody made the call, yo, that sounds ill, let's just leave it like that. But it became one of those first rap records, and we'll get to the Beastie Boys in a minute. But it was, you said the Rick Rubin influence, but Run-D.M.C really did that. And then obviously they made it their trademark later on, with songs like King of Rock, and then Walk This Way, which brought back Aerosmith's career. But it all started with Rockbox. So yeah, you could feel the push. Now, did they do it? Was it a strategic move to crossover? I don't know if that was the case. I think it was more rebellious that they were, they were the kings of rock. They could do whatever they wanted to. They had that rock star attitude, and so no one was going to put them in a box, And so Rock Box, they opened it up. So I don't think it was a desire to be mainstream, but it definitely helped with the push.
Man, you and I have kicked it with some legends together, when we've been together, and also, we both have these stories that sometimes we talk about here. But one of my favorite memories is you and I were kicking it in Austin, 2017, just hanging out in the hotel lobby, and we ran into DMC. And, after 18 years, and I know you and I talk about this, it's rare to, kind of get those goosebumps moments meeting your heroes. But I've spoken to Run before. I never knew Jay. But to just kick it with DMC for a minute, that was one of my favorite AFH memories.
Yeah, that was crazy. I'll tell you what did push hip hop to the mainstream, though, very strategically. Another great thing about 1984, besides the music, was that hip hop went to the movie theaters. There were two really critical movies that came out. And in many ways, they were two different sides of the same coin. So first was Beat Street, produced in part, I can't remember if it was produced Harry Belafonte, was a real critical part of that. And starring Radon Chong, who was a very acclaimed actress at the time, featured the New York City Breakers and a Rocksteady crew. Very, very authentic in terms of its representation of what was going on with Breakin. DJ Jazzy J was featured in it. You had cameo from Treacherous 3, Cool Mo D, and Dougie Fresh like comes in at the end. Um, it was really focused on all aspects of hip hop. So graffiti, DJing, breaking, and MCing, and really kind of open up a whole new world for kids all over the country. I remember seeing it in theater at least a few times, and I had it on beta and then VHS, and probably saw Beat Street, I don't know, 40, 50 times, but then the other movie that came out was Breakin', and that was West Coast, and sunny and fun, and like a lot more like locking and popping, and like upwork and up rocking, and like a lot more kind of flashy type dancing. You had Turbo with his broom scene, asking who Gene Kelly is, and or Fred Astaire, and it was they did the Black Eyed Peas thing where they had like two black men and a white woman, like making it like more mainstream, but super dope film too. And Shabba-Doo, and another legend we just lost, and it's amazing we're losing these legends from 1984. Was an amazing choreographer, and Soul Train dancer, the whole nine. Was Ozone, and then Michael Boogaloo Chambers was just Turbo was the illest, man. I remember spending many days like in the mirror trying to like mimic those moves, but super dope. But when did you see those films?
Much later. I mean, probably in my upper teens. And I saw them at a time when I was consuming just as much culture as possible. In I remember 18 or 19 getting a Netflix account when they were a new company, and they would mail you the DVDs. And I remember just, boom, Wild Style, boom, I'd seen Style Wars. That was the one that, as we've talked about here, has really been, influential to me first. And then I saw all the, theatrical films. But what I wanted to ask you is, you talked about that knowledge of knowing that hip hop, no matter where, was New York. So with Breakin', did that give you a greater sense of the differences and the landscape of the culture, in its entirety?
Yeah, much more so. It was really, they were just such different films. Beat Street was really meant to be, I think, authentic and gritty, and in some ways felt like almost like an indie film.
Yeah.
Spoiler alert, but like the lead character dies in the end. I mean, like it was not like a happy-go-lucky film. You had Grandmaster Melly Mel doing the eulogy with Beat Street, at the end. Um, it was a really, really dark kind of movie, especially for like teenagers at the time. We weren't used to like having the main character die. Breakin' was Hollywood, and everything that LA you think that LA is. It was sun and fun, and the good guys won in the end, and they give it, they stick it to the man, and like teach them that like street dancing is legit, and then they get the big like Broadway type show. Like it's super Hollywood,
Yeah.
but it did open my eyes that breaking was a national phenomenon. Like I said, it inspired me to break. It inspired like all sorts of competitions. I remember going to competitions in the mall. Dudes who were actually really good, like just killing it. Like it spawned a whole phenomenon, and yeah, it really brought hip hop to the mainstream and showed that it was nationwide, if not global.
You mentioned Melly Mel, and one of the things that I think as a student of 84 that is so interesting, and we see this at other times in hip hop. I think we often see it when hip hop's at its best. But we're going to talk about some of the emerging voices that came out of 84, even if they didn't get albums. But you mentioned Melly Mel, you mentioned Jazzy J, and one of the great records of 84 is It's Yours by Tila Rock. And I think that saturated itself over the next year or two, but it came out, Party Time Records 84. We talked about Larry Smith. You had these OGs that had been actively involved in hip hop, in the 70s, in the late 70s, early 80s, and they were, they still had a part to play. Kurtis Blow had come out as, like you said, a disco tinged, hip hop act, but he put out, arguably his best album in '84, Ego Trip, and showed that even 5 years after the breaks, he was evolving and he was in step with the times. And I know his own fashion aesthetic kind of changed, but it's cool that there's just this intersection. And one of the things that, you and I hold so dear is that generational conversation. It's one of the, inspirations of Ambrosia for Heads. So to see it happen in real time then, where you have all of these cool and interesting groups coming up, but at the same time, the OGs are respected, they're involved. You mentioned Colmo D and Treacherous 3, they put out an album in '84. In large part, it was a compilation of what they'd done prior. But all of these forces are at play and coexisting and kind of working together. And if you look deeper, from Houdini into UTFO, from Kurtis Blow into Run-D.M.C, there's all of these bridges, which is I love that.
That's definitely true. Like in hindsight and looking back historically, but at the time, at least for me, and I'm going to speculate that it was for the case for lots of other people who were. I was a teenager at the time, and for me, it felt like LL, Run-D.M.C, even Houdini and Fat Boys. It was kind of like a new movement. And just like and just like younger artists of today kind of like stiff arm the previous generation, it felt like that for us too. Like Kurtis Blow was cool and everything, but like Run-D.M.C, that's where it is. Like it's a new sound. Like, and we didn't have the same level of respect for that. For me, Melly Mel, and we listened to the music and everything, but it felt older. It felt almost like adult contemporary. The new stuff was these guys, and then don't forget, like shortly thereafter, you had like KRS-One and BDP and like
coming at the throats,
Rakim and Kane, and like guys who were truly just changing the way that hip hop sounded. Like the Rub, the DJ Collective have a phenomenal mix series where they do a mix for every year in hip hop from 1978 to like the present. And if you listen to that 10-year block from 1980 to 1990, hip hop radically changes in that time period. I mean, radically. In my opinion, it is at least as radical as like hearing like, Trippie Redd or Uzi Vert versus like, J. Cole or Kendrick or, Kanye, or whoever it might be.
Yeah.
Like, it's a super, super gigantic shift. And so at the time, even though it was only a couple years apart, for us, it felt like a generational divide, where these are the new artists and this is who I'm rocking with and this is my identity.
Yeah, I mean, there has to be, you and I talk about that. I mean, the fact that you were 14 in '84, 14, 15, and then I look at my life and I was, 14, 15 in 98, 99, the era of, Black Star and Common and Moment of Truth and all these different things. You hold on to that culture that's happening around you and you really kind of raise it up the flagpole. And there had to be that. I mean, obviously there were B-boys and B-girls that were, 20, 21 that had lived through that other era, but to be part of that record buying, album buying generation, of course you're gonna make your stars out of Run-D.M.C, out of LL, Beasties, so on and so forth. So let's talk about some of the folks that maybe didn't get an album in '84.
But wait, I just want to shout out one person who was featured in those movies, and that's Ice-T.
Word, of course.
Ice-T was kind of the resident MC in the place where they were doing their dancing. And, if you listen carefully, he's freestyling throughout most of the movie. He's freestyling like what's happening in the scene and like just incredibly dope. And this is pre-gangster rap Ice-T.
Electro, yeah.
Yeah, Electro. He had a song called Reckless on the soundtrack, and it plays a lot in the movie, but he's rhyming different verses to it. But interestingly, most of the dancers featured in Breakin were in a documentary called Breakin and Entering that came out before that. And it's very, there's not a ton of storyline or anything like that. It's just like slight interview footage and mostly just like dancing. But Ice-T is interviewed extensively in that. And he's talking about like anti-gang stuff and like, how, we need to like clean up the neighborhoods and like, and like bring culture and stuff like that. It's really fascinating to see the way that he's talking in that versus like what he would become and espouse in his music just like a couple years later. So real interesting transformation. But Ice-T became one of my favorite rappers at that time because of Reckless and what he was doing in Breakin', and then later like would just crack my cranium with Brian Pace. But yeah, so
Yeah, Eminem has said that Reckless was deeply influential to him, and shout out to Chris the Glove Taylor who put that song out, and the Glove who later worked on the Chronic and did a whole host of stuff with Dre and others. Has been one of AFH's biggest supporters on the West Coast, and just somebody that disperses what we stand for amongst that pioneering community, as has Ice. So shout out, to all of those guys. And yeah, and I think Ice
featured in that movie too, right? The Glove. That's him like spinning, right?
yeah, with the joint, yeah.
The Glove, yeah, it's really dope, really dope.
And Ice fits into that too, because 80 Reckless comes out in 84. But that was what I was getting at. You talked about UTFO, the album followed, but Roxanne is 84 if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah.
And obviously because Roxanne Shantae, we'll talk about that, but just talk to me of the sense you had for the artists that were on the cusp, because Crush Groove isn't out yet. But there's these really important integral 12-inch singles that are coming out, and joints that are I'm sure played on radio, maybe not where you were, but tell me about it.
Yeah, I mean, there's not much I can say beyond the albums because you got to remember, like, rap music was not remotely mainstream at that time. So we didn't have radio there. Like, at best we had like an hour or two on a university station, like, a couple nights a week. And then, the music would often take months to find its way to us, into the record stores. We had mainstream record stores. There weren't places you could go and buy 12 inches or things like that. So for me, it was mostly the albums and the videos, and that was the stuff that you were hearing, the stuff we're talking about was underground at the time because rap was like a phenomenon that people discounted and continued to say was going to, be a fad and pass like disco the whole time. So yeah, I mean, so these were the records, I think you had to be in New York in that scene, like, in the clubs and like, hearing the mix shows. Cause even in New York, like it was just still mix shows, right? It wasn't like regular rotation or anything like that for rap music. So yeah, that was it, man. That was it.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting to just to break it down a little bit. UTFO puts out Roxanne, incredible record. I think it lives up today. And sometimes I feel like artists were doomed by the labels they signed to. On one hand, you had LL and the Beastie Boys, great team around them at Def Jam, and obviously Run-D.M.C benefited from that with Russell as management and Rick as producer. But you had UTFO, Select Records, important label, responsible for Chub Rock, MOP. We can go on and on, but they don't get necessarily the legacy treatment that they deserve. So they put out, arguably their best record. Kind of fits into a lot of what we're talking about in terms of just song structure, catchy, but lyrical is all hell, in my opinion. And then
Roxanne was an amazing record. Spawned a ton of response records. It was the first time I could remember there being response records, but obviously that would like, lay the foundation for, the Bridge Wars and, all the diss records that we've heard, like, up until then. But Roxanne kind of like laid the foundation for that. One of the highlights of my high school was that I had a cousin who was a DJ at one of those universities. And UTFO was actually the first concert I ever saw. They came, played in my community center in the gym. And he brought Mixmaster Ice over to my house.
Wow.
And so Mixmaster Ice was in my house, in my living room, like just chilling with my cousin and me. And like it was mind blowing to like have someone famous like that, especially with like Roxanne in the living room. But yeah, you had records like that, and that spawned Roxanne Shantae, who was not the first female MC. You had people before her like Shell Rock from the Funky Floor Plus One, and others. But Roxanne like kind of broke through, in a way that, and especially as a solo woman MC, and being empowered like that and going up against the guys was super dope. So yeah.
Yeah, I mean, obviously, there's the biopic, but Roxanne Shante is so interesting because it gives hip hop that real time aspect, which undoubtedly existed, in the clubs. We talk about, the great battles of the early '80s at Harlem World and different places. But Roxanne, and you said not the only person to respond to UTFO, but Shante, as around 14 years old, kind of this piss and vinegar, foul mouthed girl who could rap her ass off, comes with Roxanne's Revenge,
Yeah,
released on Pop Art, which shout out to Philly, and they were putting out, everyone wanted in on the record industry, but came out, and if that battle doesn't happen, I'm not sure that we get the Bridge Wars,
yeah,
because that became what the Juice Crew stood for, is like you had Shan versus LL, you had all of this kind of elbow jabs, and that would set the tone starting in '84, for the next 4 years, and arguably it exists today, because I guarantee you not a month goes by in hip hop without a diss record of some profile.
yeah, absolutely. Some records that you had, well, just one last thing about Breaking too is that, it brought it to the mainstream, seeing those movies. But then, Breaking kind of faded, interestingly. It is that and graffiti are the two pillars of hip hop culture that have kind of receded to the background and, always present, but never at the forefront, like emceeing, first of all, and then DJing as well. But it's fascinating to me that, here we are, 36 years later, and now breaking is an Olympic sport. Like, and so it shows you just, the impact that had. And, '84 wasn't when it began, but it's definitely when it came to the mainstream for the first time.
That's a really dope point. And I was just going to say too, the DJ shows his and hers, place in the culture in '84 still, it's yours. Like Jazzy J scratching on it is as important to me as, Tila Rock's rapping. You've got these other records too, Run-D.M.C dedicated a song on their album to Jay, which was a trend that of course carried into Jazzy Jeff and the Fresh Prince and Gangstar and so on and so forth. But, you've got the world famous Supreme Team. You've got all of these different entities that DJ culture and rapping are, very much side by side still, which is a really beautiful and important thing, because a lot of what rappers took from '84, DJs did too. I mean, you go to a DJ battle or you look what the X-Men and the Invisible Scratch Pickles and other people were doing, later on, 10 years later, it was inspired by, what these OGs, DXT and Jay and so forth were doing, in '84.
Yeah, and you had songs like, Twilight 22's Electric Kingdom, which a lot of people, back then called it like Planet Rock 2, like it had that same kind of beat. Nucleus came out with Jam on It, and like that was like, the pinnacle of like electro funk. You had a lot of different records coming out, songs like Set It Off. But Set It Off felt almost more, almost like
Fancy?
house,
Yeah.
yeah, house music more so than hip hop. But
Yeah.
You had a real variety of records coming out at that time, so it was a smorgasbord. And even though, like I said, it felt like kind of a generational divide, there was still an embracing of all different types of hip hop that I find is different than what we have now, where people kind of pick a lane and kind of like shun things that aren't in that lane.
That's interesting. Yeah. And I think we should talk about fashion, but real quick, I mean, just you can't Def Jam, I think, became one of those labels, that people would buy off the jacket, buy off the label itself, which I don't know if hip hop had. I don't know. It's unfair for me to speak on it. Maybe Sugar Hill, maybe Enjoy had that for a minute, but Def Jam just became a stamp of dope. And, as I said a minute ago, one of the tragedies of hip hop is so many of the pioneers. You look at Cold Crush Brothers, or once Grandmaster Flash kind of started dealing with Elektra. If you ended up at the wrong label that didn't know how to market you or didn't give you creative control or wasn't down with sampling or forced you into a certain lane, '84, you called it a watershed moment of hip hop. That was the title we used in that editorial you mentioned. But there were a lot of artists that if you couldn't get over the hurdle of '84, it challenged your legacy, I think. And so shout out to the artists, new and old, that were able to weather that storm. And if you didn't, you got your props later on in other ways as the culture had more media around it, etc.
Yeah, well, we alluded to a few artists, you know, but I think we dive in. Like there were three game changers that all came from one label, you know. So, and the interesting thing is, you know, going back to my point about what was happening on a national scale versus what was happening in New York. So you had Tila Rock with It's Yours, you know. Many say it's the first Def Jam single. There's been some debate, you know, as of late about that. You had LL coming out with I Need a Beat, and you know, he became, you know, Kurtis Blow. The ladies love Kurtis Blow, but like, you know, LL's name literally is Ladies Love Cool J and
Yeah.
Cool James, and um, I believe he became the first solo rap superstar and the first rap sex symbol. You know, he had songs like I Need Love, you know, for the ladies, and very much embraced that side of it. You know, and he was just that came out that year. But again, in Indiana, in Ohio, in Pennsylvania, and other places that weren't like major metropolitan areas, you didn't hear those records at that time. You
Heard
know,
him a year later.
my first introduction to LL was in Crush Group when, you know, he came to the audition, and like, you know, we're telling him it's like, you know, it was too late, and he was like, nah, and he said box. And so, you know, hearing I Can't Live Without My Radio was the first time I heard LL, and it changed my life, you know. But he had already had records out that came out in '84. You know, and then the Beastie Boys. You mentioned Rick Rubin and his love of AC/DC, and their first song, Rock Hard, you know, again, which I had not heard at that time. My introduction to them was Crush Groove also, with a song called She's On It. And that song, Rock Hard, was, you know, AC/DC, like Back in
Black
Black,
and Black, yeah.
which BDP would flip, you know, just a few years later.
Yeah.
But you had these seminal records coming, and all of them led back to Def Jam, you know. And Def Jam formed in 1984. And Def Jam, you know, you mentioned Profile Records, Select Records,
Tommy Boy, yeah.
Tommy Boy, all great labels. But I don't know that there is a more important label in rap music than Def Jam, you know, dedicated to rap. You know, all those other labels had other forms of music that they pushed also.
Mm-hmm.
Def Jam was just about rap, you know, and about a certain rap aesthetic. You know, it was a purist kind of label. It was Raucous before Raucous, you know, and that label spawned so many, you know, artists that like just ran hip hop, from Jay to Meth to, you know, to Redman to, like, you know, it just goes on.
DMX, yeah.
Starting in 1984.
It's so important too. And I mean, obviously Crush Groove wasn't out in '84, but I think the idea of knowing who was behind these records, besides Blair Underwood, but to see Rick, and at that point, you know, I think Russ, you know, his name was on everything. I mean, obviously in New York and around, but you know, you started to see that Rush management or Russell Simmons manager everywhere you looked on Honest Hip Hop. But that had to just legitimize, because, you know, you're not seeing that with a lot of the different, you know, other labels that are putting it out. The Robinson Family wasn't out there like that. Tom Silverman was popular in the dance community and what he had going on, but you didn't see him in a movie like that. So to have that sense of identity, to have a label, to have that community around you, yeah, I mean, I think it's huge. And I've been a Beastie Boys fan, you know. The Beastie Boys were some of the earliest, you know. I bought not licensed ill, I bought Ill Communication in '94 when it came out, the green cassette. And I didn't know about Rock Hard until I read their book last year, because it's not a record that they really got behind. I think in their memoir that you know, Ad Rock and Mike D put out, they clown the record. And then they say, like, we were kind of gimmicky with it, especially in our raps. But that figuring it out on wax is so important. I mean, LL has the benefit of I Need a Beat is a dope ass record then and now, but not everything necessarily clicked. And shout out to Def Jam, unlike some labels that even though that didn't work, they still believed enough to come back in '85 and truly release an album by 86 that kept the lights on for the label through some leaner years. So yeah, it's just a really, really, really interesting time.
And even I Need a Beat, like the record didn't hit the way that they wanted to. So they did a different version on the album, you know, but they stuck behind LL. They knew what a star he was. And like I said, that moment in Crush Groove, which obviously is loosely based on, you know, the story of Def Jam, was his breakout moment. Like he was the highlight of the movie. Like, and I remember being in the theater watching that movie, and like everyone exploded like after that scene, you know, like it was a clear moment. It was the dawn of a new superstar. And even though that was 85, like the fact that LL kind of got his start in 84 just again shows. And this is a
Yeah.
guy who's got now 36 years in, hosting Grammys, you know, has, you know, his own TV show,
Has
uh,
a radio
a
station
radio
where you
station.
can tune in and hear these records where maybe you couldn't before, you
And
know.
coined a word that is used so liberally now, but the GOAT. Like, I
Mm.
mean, like, you know, I don't remember anyone ever saying that before. And now it's like just common parlance. So again, framework, you know, of what was built in 84. But Def Jam is, I think I did the first year I did AFH 2010, you know, I challenged myself to do a post a day, like at some point, like in September or so of 2010. And what I did was I did a countdown of the 20 greatest rap labels in history, and you know, put Def Jam at number one just because of its seminal impact. And I'll still take that to this day. Like I don't think there's
Yeah.
a greater rap label. And again, started in '84.
So, you know, we've talked about music, we've talked about film. One of the interesting things about 84 that I can absolutely speak to is it presented the aesthetic, I think, as in two ways. One, verbally, you know, and I don't know, I didn't live through it to tell you where certain phrases started, but I know that in this conversation, as a 37-year-old, I use the word ill, and I still use that word. That's part of my lexicon. And the sneakers I wear, you know, I'm much more likely to wear, you know, some Pumas or some Stan Smiths or, you know, a classic 80s sneaker than I am to go trip out over, you know, whatever's really hot right now. My own fashion aesthetic came from all of these people that we've mentioned in large part. Talk to me a little bit about how this era of rap, this year of rap, this watershed influenced culture in ways that are tangible into today.
Yeah, you know, so first of all, I wish that I've been trying to bring back the word fresh.
Mm.
You know, I think fresh is due for a comeback. So
Fresh is the word.
fresh is the word. You're
Yeah.
right. So the language was definitely part of it, but the fashion, I think, is one of the biggest things. You know, prior to '84, the biggest rappers looked like rock stars, looked like, you know, like R&B singers. There's a lot of leather and lace and, like, you know, feathers
And
and
Parliament Funkadelic in there, yeah.
yeah, the kind of stuff that you might see on a fashion runway, but you would never ever see, like, you know, dudes wearing on the street, or you get
Yeah.
clowned if you weren't an artist, you know.
If you were lucky, yeah.
Yeah. But then you had Run-D.M.C, and they step on stage and they rap about, you know, wearing not no Calvin Klein's, just wearing Lee's, but you know, they're wearing jeans. They got on their leather jackets. They got their hats on, and then they got, you know, the chains on, gold chains, and most importantly, they got their Adidas on. You know, like, and this is, and now, you know, we obviously know that there is a huge, um, you know, fashion connection between hip hop, and you know, it drives fashion. There have been gigantic deals like Sean John. You know, Sean Combs just sued Sean John, the label that he started and sold, for $20 million. He sold it for, I think, $300 million, something like that. Russell sold Fat Farm for a ton of money.
Rockaware, yeah.
Yeah. I mean, but it all started, that nexus with fashion and hip hop started, in my opinion, with Run-D.M.C talking about Adidas. And, you know, they would do tours, and we'll get to that in a second, where they would tell people to put your Adidas in the air. And like everyone in the entire building would have on their Adidas, you know, like classic Stan Smiths and shell toes. And
Superstars, all that,
yeah,
yeah.
yeah. And, you know, that was a complete shift in what it meant to be a star. You know, people talk about authentic now and embracing authenticity, but they lived it. They walked to the stage and what they got up and put on every day, and it was a complete shift. LL with the tracksuits and the Kangol, you know, and like, you know, the
Gold
gold.
chain.
So it was like that was the streets like that. They completely shifted, you know, what people were wearing and how people dressed. So yeah, that was a major shift right there.
And what's so dope is, I mean, you know, it didn't happen in '84, but the inroads within a couple of years, there were partnerships made. You know, obviously Adidas groundbreaking work with Run-D.M.C, and later, you know, Jay even gets his own sneaker. You know, LL, I think one of his first sponsorship deals was with Troop, if I'm not mistaken. You know, and then obviously goes on to Fubu and all these other things, but you know, it started by, we're going to show you what's cool, and within the next few years, we're going to, you know, we're going to level up and break bread in a way that benefits the culture and community, which is so dope. But yeah, I mean, I truly believe that the fashion of '84 and that era has endured far more than other eras. And I know this is really about music, but that stands for something for sure, because that's how we see our artists. Those are the photos that we define as cool in our minds and epic and all of these things. And no fashion is competing. What would you rather wear, man? Like a Adidas sweatsuit or like a quadruple XL Knicks jersey, you know?
Definitely,
Yeah.
definitely Adidas sweatshirt.
I know for me, I don't wear my hats to the side anymore like I was doing in '98, you know, trying to look like LP. So
I tried to put on my ex baseball jersey from 40 Acres and a Mule. The other night. I look insane, dude. I look like I needed to gain about 100 pounds in order to justify it, you know. So yeah, absolutely, man. The fashion was amazing. You know, so another thing I want to talk about though too is you mentioned cultural moments and how to shift culture is that hip hop hit the road. You know, it became live and direct, and so I mentioned, and I've talked a lot about how inaccessible the actual culture was beyond, you know, the breakout records and the videos that I got. But what changed in '84 was, you know, the Fresh Fest tour. You know, Run-D.M.C, Whodini, the Fat Boys, and Kurtis Blow. You know, you got these guys going on the road and selling out arenas. That's something that had never been done before. You know, like I said, my first concert was in a community center in a gym, but you had, you know, rap at the highest level, selling out Madison Square Garden and arenas across the country with four artists anyway that would, you know, set a paradigm and you know, even the name like Fest, like to me it was like, you know, Woodstock obviously and the other festivals, but this is the first time hip hop had its own festival, and now it's such a mainstream thing. You know, that is not celebrated enough. It was marred at the time because there was some incidents that happened, like, you know, some gunplay. It was blown out of proportion. You know, I'm not denying that things happen, but given the mainstream media coverage of it and like the change in like insurance and how difficult it became to like actually do the shows, it was blown out of proportion. And I think we can all like, you know, figure out why that was. But going back and looking at it for what it was, it was a major celebration of hip hop and deserves like, you know, props for taking these people who seem inaccessible and taking them on the road, and that was the major impact as well.
yeah, I mean, just to fill in the map that way, and you're absolutely right. And with that said, you gave me something that I want to say that needs to be said is, you know, the Source magazine was still 4 years away from being born. You know, I don't even know if at this point Word Up was out yet, but you know, shout out to Nelson George and the like of people that really went to the mat and wrote about these records with the greatest of integrity in places like Billboard and the Village Voice and so on and so forth. And I know that those figures, those pioneers exist in all cities, but as you and I are two members of the media that hold our responsibility on the highest, you know, shout out to the people that really helped legitimize hip hop and its music as more than a fad.
Yeah, man. So 1984, the greatest year in hip hop, greatest records, greatest artists, laid the foundation for everything that came after it. Any debate?
You know, I think that the debates could be a few. You know, and I think you kind of touched on one right there. You look at other years, and I'll choose the two that I think come up the most often: 88 and 94. The hip hop map in the United States fills in a little bit more, and globally. You know, 88, you've got the beginning of the Ghetto Boys here in where I am in Houston. You've got Two Live Crew in Miami. You've got Too Short up in the Bay. You know, 94 even more so. You got Dungeon Family, you know, Outkast. You've got you know, artists all over the Midwest and the South that are starting to make noise and get recognition. By that point, LA has 3 or 4 different lanes to choose from. The Bay is diversified. Um, so you have more diversity and arguably more quality, just given the volume of records that were coming out, both on the singles level as well as obviously the albums. I think that's huge. Um, you know, you and I've talked about depth here. We've talked about Houdini and Run-D.M.C putting out albums, and the Fat Boys, that people know beyond just what was fed to them, beyond the singles and the videos, which may or may not have even existed. Obviously, you get to 94. I think most hip hop heads know the words to probably every song on Ready to Die. You get to 88, you know, Follow the Leader. Like, these are records that are treated the same way. Like early in the Beatles' career, there might be a few joints on the album, or the Rolling Stones. By the time you get to Sgt. Pepper, it's a lean back experience. So I think 84, that's a blind spot. I'm not saying that, I'm just looking at the weaknesses. And also, as I just alluded to, there's more resources by, you know, 88, 94, 2000, 2010, pick a year. You've got more media, you've got more video, you've got longer samplers to make more interesting production. You've got wordsmiths coming on in the mid 80s, you know, your Rakims, your Kanes, your G-Raps, your Kool Keiths, that influence a generation after them. So there's that. But that being said, I still think that 84 has a lot of things going for it that no other year can have. And if you take it out of the equation, you get nothing. The house of cards falls apart. It truly is, you know, the watershed year for hip hop.
Sounds like we got a few more years to debate.
86?
So, yeah, I'm looking forward to
Word.
that. But back to the present. Anything you want to talk about that happened in the last week?
Yeah, man. We just talked about a lot of artists at the foundation of Def Jam. You know, rest in peace to my man Ricky Powell. You know, he was the photographer, I think came on in 85, 86. Thanks to Bill Adler, who was a big brother and still is to me, the head of publicity for director of publicity for Def Jam. Ricky shot, you know, so many of the iconic photos of not only Run-D.M.C and the Beastie Boys and, you know, LL Cool J, but also your Public Enemies. He has some of the greatest photos of all time of Big L, of Easy E on the phone rolling something up. You know, Ricky was a complicated individual, and I didn't know him well, but I knew him over the years. And you know, R.I.P. And I also want to give a rest in peace to Double K, Michael Turner from People Under the Stairs. And you and I were texting, you know, in the wake of his passing. I've been listening to a lot of, you know, PUTS. But R.I.P. man, our heroes, our peers, they're reminding us all the time that, you know, we're mortal. And just it's a reminder to me, and I hope everyone else, man, give the next person, give your heroes their flowers.
Word, word. Speaking of flowers, I know you put this in the document too, but it looks like Russell Peters, world-renowned comedian, and I don't know that he's as well known in the U.S. as like he is globally, but gigantic. I mean, this guy is one of the biggest comedians in the world, but he's also an incredible hip hop head. Like, you know, I've been to his house, I've seen him, you know, interact with like some like of the sharpest lyrical like assassins in the world, like who are friends of his. Like the dude is major, and he is doing a documentary on D&D Studios, which, you know, people might not know, but home to the legendary DJ Premier for many years, and
DITC,
Craig's
Camp
crew.
Click, yeah.
A lot of the finest records in New York rap, from the, you know, early '90s through the late aughts came through that studio, and so I have no doubt that Russell, being the true hip hop fan that he is, will do that incredible justice. So very excited about that.
Yeah, and I'd be remiss not to give a shout out to the Breakin Adams podcast who broke that story. They did a dope interview. It's not very long, 40 minutes with Doug, the co-founder of D&D. And that was a place I got to go. And Russell Peters is, to your point, just is somebody who's taken a platform and given a lot of opportunities to hip hop OGs. I know when you and I did our podcast episode with Lord Finesse, he was catching a flight that week. Based on Instagram, Finesse is still out there working with Russell, and Russell's been really good to a lot of our heroes, and giving them platform and opportunity. So I can't wait, because I've been to D&D. I think you have too, right?
Yeah.
That was the spot. So
in the D&D, yeah, it was crazy, man. Yeah, I've had fun. I was with Primo on D&D a few times, so super dope.
Legendary spot. I can still smell the cess.
Exactly. I heard a real cool record that added to the playlist this week. Freddie Gibbs and Schoolboy Q, Gang Signs. Real soulful record. Another soulful record by Fat Joe.
Damn, that's the joint.
Yeah. You want to talk about that one?
Yeah, I mean, Sunshine the Light by Fat Joe, DJ Khaled, and the co-producer of the song Amorphous. Man, it's just like if you were to take the perfect contemporary blend, because you got your Luther Vandross on there, and then you've got the a Rihanna remix. And it's cool because they cleared all the samples and they made, I mean, Joe is ageless, man. He just keeps coming out with new and more stuff. And I know it's a party record, it's a dance record, it's the windows down, play it in your car record, but it's the most I've liked a Joe record, since the Jay-Z All the Way Up remix.
He just keeps making hits, man. That dude, like, I mean, who would have known the dude who's got came out with Flow Joe, and like shit is real. Going back to DJ Premier, I'm sure that record was made in D&D, like the Primo
Word.
Who would think that dude, who was like such an underground cat, would be like just an unstoppable commercial force now with Khaled. It's pretty crazy, but yeah, super dope.
Yeah, there's a record I'm going to omit because we have an upcoming conversation with its creator. I'll let our listeners guess who that might be, but there's 3 albums I just want to shout out that have dropped since we last did an episode that have been in heavy rotation for me. Madlib, put out Sound Ancestors, and he did it. It's a solo album under the Madlib name. Some people are saying it's the first. I struggle with that a little bit because Madlib has, put out all of his Beat Conductor kind of volumes, but this is on a higher level. It just seems like in the marketing push, Sound Ancestors, but he did it in part with Fortet, who he trusted with a lot of kind of raw beats. There's some really good interviews in the New York Times and NPR on how it happened, but Madlib does something on the instrumental tip and I just enjoy it. That has been in heavy rotation for me. I also want to give a huge shout out to Breezy Bruin from the Juggernauts. You and I spent a really great episode talking about MF Doom, whose history on the solo tip kind of started at Fondulum. My favorite thing besides Operation Doomsday that Fondulum put out is Clear Blue Skies by the Juggernauts. A family of MCs, Breezy Bruin, Buddy Slim, and Queen Heroin out of the Bronx. This is Breeze's first solo album. People may know him from being the title character on Prince Paul's Prince Among Thieves, who did all that rapping. MC from the Bronx, who is just so talented. And he put a joint out called Hindsight. And it's a great lean back record, very, very, very conceptual. And you got Black Milk, DJ Spinner, Marco Polo, a lot of heads involved in it, but great album. And then lastly, Devin the Dude, who is another artist that maybe it's because I'm in Texas right now, but Devin continues to prove that he can make phenomenal music, 20 years after just trying to live, almost 30 years after the Odd Squad. And his new album is called Soulful Distance. I think I have that title right, kind of playing off of Social Distance. And Scarface is on there, Slim Thug, Big Pokey, like a lot of H-Town legends. But Devin, that ability that he has to be melodic, to kind of sing, to kind of channel the blues in his raps while rapping about wine, weed, and women. That's just been a lean back album for me. And I've heard a lot of other people say like, yo, man, this more people need to be talking about it. So here I am.
Yeah, man, consistent dude. Been doing it for many, many years, you know. So cool. What's your song of the week?
After that harangue, man, I'm gonna give it up to Devin on the song Discouraged. I sent it to you a couple days ago. That is man, that's everything I love about the dude. What about you?
Word. For me, it's Adventures in the Land of Music Dynasty, man. Like to be honest, I just heard it for the first time last night, but you know, most heads will know it instantly as the sample that powers Whodini by Camp Low. But the song is just a stone cold groove. Love it. Love it.
Man, shout out to Ski Beats. Well, I was late in the game. You and I are both sample heads. I heard it last year on a Spotify mix of some kind, and I was like taken aback because I'd never heard the original. And man, that's the one.
Yeah, no, it's a great one, man. Well,
Well,
yo,
every 84.
yeah, 84, man. Look forward to doing many more of these.
Absolutely. Yo, you take care of yourself. Everyone out there do the same.
Yep, later. Peace.